Hi everyone, welcome to Village Kids. So happy you can make it. I have 4 guests on joining me. It's really awesome. I'm Lauren, your host. I've been here for the past 6 months.
She's just been in the waiting room.
Yeah, I have been in the waiting room. Today they let me
in. Village Kids.
Hi everyone, this is the Village Kids podcast. I'm Annika.
I'm Erin.
I'm Julia.
And I'm Marga.
And we're 4 recently reconnected childhood best friends. And for today's episode, we actually have a special guest with us. It's my very dear friend, Lauren Lee.
Hi, everyone.
We've known each other for the last 3 years because we went to the same university and we were both volunteering for the same peer program at UBC. And so what peer programs are essentially like student leadership opportunities on campus for students to help make the experience of other students on campus better. And the particular program that we were in was Wellness Peers. It was all about health and wellness and providing support to other students. And yeah, Lauren and I just really clicked in this program. I couldn't get rid of her.
Annika tried to get rid of me multiple times and it's impossible.
Lauren, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
I just want to say that it has been a privilege to be Annika's friend for the past 3/4 years. I realized it was 4 years ago that we met. Happy friendiversary, Annika. She didn't get me anything. It's fine. It's been so fun getting to know each other better and to get to be on this podcast. That's why I'm friends with Annika, actually. It's to just be a guest on this podcast. So thank you. I'm so honored and excited to be here with all of you and to meet Annika's great friends.
Oh, I feel like you've turned my heart into mush in the last minute. I don't know now what to say. I feel like we have such a shtick where we just joke around a lot, but I'm also really grateful to know you, Lauren, and I'm glad that you're here. Yeah.
I start crying.
Cry?
Great way to start.
Okay, yeah. So
I did not answer your question. I just realized. I totally
yeah. And I was completely fine with that.
You were gonna move on.
Okay. Yeah, so Lauren, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Like Annika mentioned, I go to UBC. I'm majoring in math and psychology. I'm actually graduating this term, which is pretty exciting. I've been at UBC for 6 years, so I'm pretty ready to graduate, move on to the next chapter of my life. Who knows what that's going to be? I don't know, so we'll find out. And a lot of the work that I've done revolves around mental health, particularly promotion and education. And that's how Annika and I met, through Wellness Peers, helping students maintain mental health and well-being. And that is the field that I'm most interested in. So I'm excited that maybe we'll get to touch on that a little bit today.
Yeah, for sure. When I asked you what topics you'd be interested in talking about, you brought up vulnerability, specifically as a means to connecting with others. What's your connection to this topic and why is it important to you?
Great question. I want to hear from all of you guys as well. So the reason why no one was prepared to answer this question.
I felt that
inside air. Never mind. No questions to be asked. That's okay.
I suddenly felt like the teacher called me out of nowhere.
Socratic method.
Oh my gosh. There was just a moment of everyone had the shared expression. I knew I did something wrong right away, but I wasn't sure what. But okay, yeah. To answer the question, why I wanted to speak about vulnerability is because a lot of the mental health work that I do, that Annika and I did together, involved peer-to-peer support. And I feel like a big part of mental health education is learning about self-disclosure, which is basically just sharing things that are personal and opening up to other people. And Annika and I were on the receiving end of a lot of people opening up about different things that they're going through, whether it be academic stress or relationship issues or experiencing any kind of hardship. We got to be the supporters and actively listen and use our empathy skills to help other people. So because so much of the work that I do involves some aspect of vulnerability, whether it's being on the receiving end or actually being the vulnerable people, which is so much harder than being the listener sometimes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to create a greater conversation and continue this talk about mental health, which I think is so much more important because of this really isolating time that we're in. So all of this to say, it's something that Annika and I have talked about quite a bit. So I thought it would be cool to expand on it and share some stories.
To start off, Lauren, I'm interested to hear what your experiences have been with vulnerability in the context of the pandemic.
Let me think. So since the pandemic started, I feel like my conversations have become a lot more meaningful because we all collectively are experiencing the same thing. And a lot of us can relate to each other, whether we live in North America or live in other places in the world. We're all experiencing like loneliness or maybe loss of fulfillment from meaningful roles. So I find that whenever I'm having conversations with friends, which are all on Zoom, it seems like a prerequisite that we like check in on each other. It's like how are you doing? But how are you really doing? When we say how are you in casual conversation, we're not expecting people to say, actually, I'm not doing too well. But I feel like now since the pandemic started, people are like genuinely answering the question, which I think is really great because ultimately we want to be able to best support our friends when we can and know when they're not doing too well. So I do feel like there has been more of a push of speaking more about not only just mental health, but just being honest about how you're feeling. And if you're not having a good day, then that's totally normal. Hopefully, when we do get to engage in life normally again, I don't know if things will ever be like normal the way they were before, but maybe we'll continue to have more open conversations and not just do this superficial, how are you?
I think something that I learned a lot from our conversations was this analogy that Annika brought up. Imagine you're in a room, the only thing parting you from another person is a wall, but then you're going through a similar experience, you're just not talking. And I think about that analogy quite a lot, especially now, living alone and having to go through things and having friends, but not necessarily explaining or talking about what you're going through. You mentioned like how this time is so isolating, and I think I've tried, well, through this podcast and through other platforms to really break down those barriers that this time is putting up. I don't think I'm perfect at it in terms of being able to share my experience all the time, like all my struggles, but I think I'm able to reach out. And I think that's me in my process of trying to be vulnerable during this time. And that's my way of trying to connect with people as well.
For me, it's pretty much the same. Like, because of the whole pandemic, like the only time I get to talk to these friends is if like I reach out or they reach out. So it's kind of like this thing where if you don't make the effort, you're not gonna have anyone to talk to. So it's like the pandemic specifically forced me into being like more vulnerable with my friends and like sharing real things now, because it's like we don't have the same day to day anymore like we used to when we were in school. So it's like when we talk to each other, it's like with this whole purpose of like sharing what's actually happening in my new day to day. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually feel the same. Like, okay, so I'm an introvert, so I lock myself out from everyone's lives pre-pandemic, but I feel like I still do right now, but like less. Like I talk to them like almost every day. I didn't used to do that. We weren't even talking at all before. So I feel like I'm always vulnerable with you guys. Like whatever it is I'm facing, like I'm just telling you straight up. Like I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. So I think that's how the pandemic affected me.
How about you, Annika?
Okay, so what Marga mentioned earlier about something that I had brought up before, I brought it up because I had physically been in like multiple times throughout this pandemic in the same space as other people who were 100% going through some version of what I had been going through. For me, I live in a condo and I'm just thinking about my next door neighbors or the people who live above or below me. We may be going through parallel experiences, but neither of us are really saying out loud how we feel. This whole experience thus far of, I guess, the absence of vulnerability a lot of times has really made itself known. the impact of it on me and those feelings that I keep within myself, just sort of like if I were a cup, like overflowing. And so I feel like vulnerability over the pandemic has really taken on a new meaning in terms of its importance, and something that I have to be very intentional about doing, because my instinct is to go the opposite direction. Vulnerability can sometimes be different depending on your baseline, right? Like vulnerability can sometimes start in terms of like a personal thing, like trying new things and that feeling uncomfortable, or vulnerability on a different level. Like for me, it'd be talking to my family, or to you guys, friends who are in my inner circle. Then there's the vulnerability of like talking to literal like strangers. So I'm curious as to like what your definition for vulnerability is in this case.
When I think about vulnerability, the first thing I think of is sharing something really difficult with a friend or a family member. But then it got me thinking that is just such a small aspect of what vulnerability is. Like when I think of it, being vulnerable means like stepping outside of your comfort zone a little bit and expressing yourself in some way. So for example, maybe if you act in a play and you put yourself out there, or you create a piece of art that really expresses something personal to you, I find that those are also acts of vulnerability. So anytime you feel just like slightly uncomfortable, but you're like pushing through and showing parts of yourself, I think that encompasses vulnerability.
I guess something of interest to me, like, and that Erin brought up earlier, was social media and how one might be vulnerable in that context. And maybe to extend it to a larger conversation would be like, how can you be vulnerable with people who are virtually strangers to you?
So I mentioned to Annika that I have a little bit of a story time that I would like to share with you all. It requires me to be a little bit vulnerable, so bear with me. It starts with my grandma, who was in hospice care in September to November of last year. So this was a few months ago. And I remember the time just being so isolating, because there were so many restrictions, like at the hospital, like only one person could visit at a time. And then just generally feeling like disconnected from my friends and the community during such a difficult time. I remember my friend Rit, who was also a good friend of Annika, we all used to volunteer together. He sent me a Facebook post and he said, "Oh, I read this and this made me think of you." And it was a post in a Facebook group called Subtle Asian Traits. And the post that he sent me was about this person whose grandpa died from COVID. And he was just talking about the different challenges he had to face during that period leading up to his grandpa's death. And I found that so many things that he wrote about, I completely could relate to. He also mentioned the COVID restrictions. Where he lived, it was much more severe, so he couldn't visit his grandpa at all. And just the overall feeling of like frustration of like people not wearing masks or people not adhering to the regulations, and that prevented him from getting to see his grandpa before he died. I just felt like for the first time that like someone got it, like someone knew exactly how I was feeling and hadn't been articulated the same way before. And I felt connected, and immediately I just thought I have to make my own posts. I want to make something that made me feel the same way that this person made me feel. So after my grandma died, about a month and a half later, I decided to make my own post. And I wrote about the acts of generosity and kindness that I saw when she was in hospice care, because I had so many outpouring support of love from friends and from strangers. And I just wanted to put some content out there that would hopefully like warm people's hearts and also create this greater conversation about grieving and death and dying during COVID. So I made this post. It took me like 30 minutes to write, and then I sent it, and I didn't really think much about it. And I didn't even know if it would be like approved and if they would even post it. But 3 hours later, they post it, and I was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Like I just shared like the most vulnerable, like most personal story, and now it's on the internet for everyone to see. The response was so crazy. People started like commenting. and sending their condolences and writing their own stories about if maybe they had a grandparent that was going through something really similar. And I was just so blown away with how many people engaged with it and how many people could resonate to my story. And it was actually had no problem with strangers seeing the posts because there's this degree of anonymity. I'm just some random person and it's some random story. But the actual vulnerable part that I felt was the fact that so many people in my personal life had seen the post and had messaged me about it. Even people that I don't even know that well, or maybe people I've worked with in the past that we don't know each other on this personal level. And now they know all my secrets. So it was this really interesting dynamic. But ultimately, I'm so happy that I got to post that. And I shared something that was so personal to me because it allowed me to connect with so many people all around the world and realize that my story, it's so similar to what so many people are going through. So even though it took some courage to write about my grandma's death, it made me feel more connected and less isolated during the experience. So I'm really happy that I did that. And I do think it's like the most vulnerable thing that I've probably ever done in my entire life. I just wanted to share that story, and maybe it can inspire people if they want to share their own stories. And it doesn't have to be as public as Subtle Asian Traits, where there's like 2 million people, but it can be as simple as maybe finding different pockets of ways to share your story online, because it can feel really cathartic. And to me, it felt really meaningful to get to share this story, especially because we didn't get to have a funeral, or we didn't want to do a Zoom funeral for my grandma, just didn't feel right. So doing this post, it really felt like it was my way to commemorate her and to celebrate her life. If the pandemic didn't happen, I never would have done that. But it allowed me to let other people in, and I got a lot of meaning from that.
I think that whole concept of being more vulnerable, it's so powerful. In being soft, you're also strong, if not stronger, because you're empowering yourself to take control of your situation, your feelings. I really appreciated your whole story and you sharing that with us, because it just really took me back to so many different moments in life where what we thought was soft or like being vulnerable, oh, you're weak and stuff, it's actually you being strong. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
I think what you said was like on the dot in terms of like how grateful I am that you shared that story. Like I remember when you had posted it, I don't think I had spoken to you in a while at that time, and I saw that post and I just remember feeling so like connected to you at that point. Like that was what you had gone through in that 2 or 3 months that I had not spoken to you, and just also seeing the outpouring of support on what I thought like Subtle Asian Traits, I associate it to be like a very lighthearted and almost like a jokey type of page. But then when I saw that and I saw people's responses were like equally as giving of themselves also, it was confirming of like humanity in a way. Yeah, it's almost like a currency where like if you show me your cards, then okay, I'll show you my cards kind of thing. And sometimes people are more comfortable being the first to do that versus like some people would rather wait it out. I think I'm on the second half of that. That's why like I think what you did was a really big thing, I'd say. In terms of like how we feel about vulnerability, I'm wondering like how much of culture plays a role in that. The idea of showing emotion and opening up as a form of weakness, I think, is something that's just so ingrained in my head.
I can relate, definitely. I definitely feel like in Asian culture, there's very little talk about mental health. At least in my house, we didn't talk about our emotions at the dinner table. It just wasn't typical. Like there's more of an expectation to be more stoic and expressionless. And I think it's definitely more for self-identifying males. So I definitely felt that growing up. It wasn't that I was scared of being vulnerable, but it was just that I wasn't seeing that kind of behavior being modeled. So I didn't really do that. And I really feel like it wasn't until university when there was more of a push of talking about mental health and me getting more involved in mental health volunteering that I realized that there's so much value in getting to be open with other people. And I was kind of amazed when I first started volunteering in the role that people were willing to be so open to someone that they had never even met. I was like, whoa, this is so bizarre. I wouldn't even say this to like my close friends. Like, how are you doing this? Which is what I said during that, of course. And then I got kicked out of the program. Just kidding. I do feel like the more North American approach is being more willing to be open. And I see it in the workplace too. Like if we're having a meeting, I remember one time my supervisor who was leading the meeting was just saying like, I'm really sorry guys if I feel kind of low energy because I had an all-nighter last night because my baby wouldn't stop crying. And when she said that, it really like broke down the walls, and we saw my supervisor not as just like our manager, but someone who's just another human that is like dealing with their own stuff. And it just, I felt like really allowed us to feel more open and ultimately helped us to do better work. So I think there's not only is there a lot of value of vulnerability just with friends, but also in professional contexts as well. And now I'm on a completely different tangent. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear from you guys growing up in the Philippines. Did you feel like vulnerability ever played a role when you were kids?
Growing up, so my family went through a big problem. I feel like our family had to pretend being strong. It's like we had to be strong for our mom. My siblings had to be strong for me. I had to be strong. Because if I wasn't strong, everybody would just fall. So it was hard until this very day. We're not so open with our emotions. That's why I run to these people.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Julia. That sounds really hard. It goes to show that it can sometimes take something like big and like really tragic to get maybe the whole family to open up. I've definitely seen that as well in my own family. It's like this strange thing where like you don't usually see maybe your family members like crying or being expressionful. I made that word up. But do you find that after incidences like that, do you feel you and your family have like opened up more after that? Or do you kind of go back to having your guard up and not talking about it as much?
When we do talk about it, we kind of share how we felt before, but we don't share how we presently feel. Yeah, it's hard. I don't know. I don't know if it's just our family, but like we're actually super close. Our family's super close, but not in that sense.
Yeah, it makes me think of are you guys familiar with the 5 love languages?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Okay.
yes, we are.
I feel like it's our audience. Yes, you guys are. And I'm thinking for a lot of people, the love language is words of affirmation and words of affection. But that's just not what we do in Asian cultures. We don't say I love you to our siblings or even to our parents. At least I don't usually. It's a cultural thing. And it doesn't mean that our family loves each other less. It's just that we show love in different ways. So maybe Julia and your family, you just express love through different ways. It might not be this like emotional self-disclosure, but you do that with your friends, and that's how you show love to your friends. So it just depends on the context, and just because of the way that we were raised, and that's just the culture that we're in, it's just not typical to be vulnerable like that. So I can definitely relate to what you're saying.
I'm not sure anymore if it's like an Asian thing or if it's a generational thing. Like, is it because our parents were brought up that way? That's how they brought us up this way. And now like things are changing. There's social media, all of these new like parenting tips online and stuff. Suddenly like the way of parenting it looks so much different now than it looked like when we were kids. My sister, for example, now, she has a kid who's like 2.5 years old. We're teaching her to let her feelings out. So it's like, you know, when you were kids and then you'd cry, the first thing you'd hear from your parents would be like, stop crying, like don't cry, it's okay, don't cry. Now with my sister, I hear it's okay to cry, like I understand, I know you're sad because you can't get that toy. It's like we acknowledge her feelings and we let her feel that it's okay to cry and let it out so that there's like some sort of release, right? So I feel like it's also partly like an internet age thing, maybe.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Erin. I do feel like it's not only culturally, but there's this interaction with the time that we're living in and also culture. That's such a good point. It's making me think, when I was a kid, I was also taught that you should stop crying like as soon as you can, and or not cry loudly. And maybe that's why I never cry as an adult. I'm like making connections to my past. So that's really interesting. That's so great that there's just this push to allow your kids to feel their emotions, and also to be taught that there's no such thing as like good or bad emotions, but they're all just neutral, and they're all things that we're going to experience. And it's not bad to experience sadness or anger or frustration, but it's just healthy to process it. And maybe it's through like physically crying, and that can feel really cathartic, or they're just allowing the kids to process their emotions in a way that makes sense. Could be setting up the kids for success so they can better control their emotions as adults.
I think what makes it so hard is when, like, on top of whatever you're feeling, there's an overlay of like judgment. For me, that's something that kicks in, or that I have to be conscious of, that like, no, maybe this judgment that I'm inserting is only making it worse or preventing me from being able to let that feeling go. For me, when I don't express what I'm feeling, no matter what, like, I know at some point it'll come out when I least expect it to.
I feel like anything that we try to like bury down or suppress, like eventually everything comes to the surface and bubbles over, to use your example. Like it's really hard after like a long time keeping something in for so long. During the time when you do open up, it feels like this huge burden that's off your shoulders. And it's like, oh, okay, like not only were you able to verbally say it, and now like you let someone in on how you're feeling, but it's also the physical part of crying. And it's like, it's a physiologically like a reaction that you're having. Something that I was listening to on a different podcast, they were talking about how just like the value that crying has, like physically and mentally. And they were giving advice for people that don't cry easily, aka me. So I was like, oh, this is perfect for me. And they were saying that sometimes it can be really hard to cry about the thing that you're sad about. The host was saying, like, if I want to cry it all out, but I don't feel like I can, maybe like there's so much tension and you can't like cry on demand, but they'll watch like sad videos of like, veterans coming home and being reunited with their kids or their spouses, or like sad dog videos or something like that. And then that will like get the tears going. And then even though they initially were crying from like the sad video, the actual emotions that are coming out are like whatever they're dealing with at the moment. And I thought that was such a cool like psychological trick to like get yourself to cry, because it really can feel really nice, as Annika just illustrated. And I also just thought of another thing. Our friend Hallie that worked with Annika and I, she was saying that she has a friend that schedules crying in her calendar, like every day, 8 p.m., 15 minutes to cry on demand. She can just go for it. And I was like jealous. I'm like, how do you bring
do that
yourself
with
to
my
cry?
friends.
Julia said,
who wants to cry with me tonight? And they're all like, game. I'll be up.
oh wow, you weren't kidding when you said that you cry. Like,
oh dude, I cry. I cry.
wow, jealous. Man, you gotta teach me some tricks.
I feel like that struck me, like that conversation about being okay to cry. For the longest time, I've just been always known as like the person who will cry so easily. And I think this last year I've just felt that, okay, I'm going to try to not cry as much. I don't want to keep crying without knowing why I'm crying sometimes. Like, I don't want to worry anyone because I know I'm not at that point. Like, I haven't reached that cap. I have no idea what was the point of this. But I think.
But don't ever worry. Don't invalidate your feeling. Whatever you're feeling, there's no cap.
Okay, I got the point back. But just that the idea of like scheduling crying, or like just all of these different things, like it's just so. Is it normal to just cry? Because that would mean so much to me.
I'll invite you to my crying session. Do you want to do one tonight, Marty?
We might need that.
I don't know if I feel like, because it was just something that I was like, oh, There are people also who cry like without needing to have to get to a certain
Explanation.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And it just made me think about how I was watching this video. It was a BuzzFeed video about this therapist that answers like anonymous questions. And one of the questions that someone sent was, why do I feel like crying when I don't know why I'm sad? Or like, why do I feel like crying all the time when I can't identify the problem with it? And she said something very similar, really close to what Annika said. Like, if you have a cup and then you're overflowing it, and then you're not like spilling any of the cup out like every so often, but you're just like letting the water fill up. And it's kind of like, if you don't take time to like process that or share that with other people, and then all of a sudden it'll just like pour over the edge, and then you cry all of a sudden, which is kind of
Suppressed
exactly what
feelings.
Annika.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You
And
watched
she
it
was
just happen.
Yeah, exactly. So I can totally understand like that feeling of like, wait, why am I crying? I don't know where this is coming from. And I think that's a very normal experience. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about maybe like that feeling of a little bit of self-judgment, like, why am I crying? Like, what's wrong with me? But just know that that is a really common experience, and it can feel really strange, but I'm happy that you still let yourself cry, even though you might be a little bit critical of yourself. So thank you for sharing that.
I feel like it's actually a lot more common than you guys think. Like it happens to me a lot. It's just that I don't talk about it. That's why I feel like you think it's just you, but it's really not. So like when I was in isolation in Manila, I'd cry really often. Yeah, but I don't think I ever told you guys then because I have a hard time talking about like the current emotion. As Julia mentioned, like I can talk about it now that it's done. I'd be like, yeah, I had a really hard time. But then at that time, I could not bring myself to be like, I'm so sad to the point where I cry like every other day. I think at that time too, like I couldn't pinpoint why I was feeling that way. But like now that I'm distanced from that time in my life, it's like now I can easily say like, oh, I was sad because of all of these factors, and like that is why I was breaking down so often. But like, yeah, it's really normal, Margie. Like, don't feel bad that you cry. Like, as I said, we're always just here to talk to you. Like, I may not cry with you, but I'm here to listen.
I'll cry with you.
We can help solve it, Margie, if that's what you want.
I wonder why we tend to associate crying with like shame or like weakness, and we like sometimes see crying as a bad thing. But I wonder, like, with more conversations about mental health, if we can normalize the experience of crying, which is just like at the root of it is like just a physical reaction, but we had just attach emotionality to it. So that's interesting to think about. I've never really thought about that before. So you guys are sparking such interesting conversation. Thank you for bringing all this up.
Before we end this, I have like one last question that I wanted to ask. Something that I hope you talk about later is the podcast that you host. So it's called It's All Good. I'm going to plug it for Lauren. And it's all about health and well-being and different aspects of wellness. What we've done here is kind of just like a snippet of the kind of conversations that Lauren has with people. From one podcast host to another, I wanted to ask you, because we've just started this whole guest series thing, what are some tips that you have for creating, I guess, an atmosphere like this that promotes like the opening up of people about their stories and just being vulnerable? So do you have any tips for us?
Sure. When I saw that question on the Google Doc, I was like, whoa, I really have to think about this because it's not something I ever like consciously thought about. But from just being here for the past hour and a half, I felt like I didn't have to do anything. Like, you guys brought yourselves and you guys brought your stories, and just seeing the way that you guys like interact and connect with each other, it's just so heartwarming to see. It feels like you guys just had such a strong bond between all of you, and that you guys felt like so comfortable sharing things. And me being an outsider, like not having met you guys for the first time today, literally an hour and a half ago, it's such an honor to just sit here and to listen to all of your guys' stories. And you guys made me feel so welcome. And and almost like we didn't just meet today, because I watch your podcast. So it's like, I know you guys. But any advice that I have for initiating vulnerability? First of all, Annika, thank you for bringing up my podcast. I really appreciate that. I think a big part of it is, I would say, not that I orchestrate it in a way, but I always ask guests that I am close to and we have a bond with. So I've never had anyone on that I didn't know super well. So it just made it easier, since we're already friends. It made it easier for people to open up. So I wouldn't say that I'm like an expert at trying to like pry things out of people, because I don't even know how to do that. But while in the conversation, when we're recording the podcast, I just ask a lot of open-ended questions, and I just am willing to also share parts of myself. Like if I have had a similar experience, and I'll bring it up, and then I find that my guest is more comfortable like sharing more details of what they're experiencing. So I think it's just a combination of having empathy for the person and also just coming from a place of curiosity. And it's just finding a balance of what is something where maybe my guest has to push themselves a little bit outside their comfort zone, but not too much outside their comfort zone, and they still feel comfortable talking about things. The whole purpose of why I wanted to do my podcast was to connect with others and to share tips about well-being. I hope that my guests can feel comfortable sharing things during my podcast. So thank you for mentioning it.
Yeah, wow. I feel like the last hour and a half, I can't believe we started from where we did. And like, you guys, we all didn't, like, you guys didn't know Lauren, and I don't think I had opened up like that recently to Lauren. And I think that's just like, I don't know if this will appear in the recording, but just a testament to how much you create that atmosphere, Lauren. And I hope everyone checks out your podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. You guys made me feel so comfortable. Like I don't think I would be like this if it was a different group of people. Like you guys like welcomed me into your arms. That's weird. Just you made it a space that it feels safe for me to like be myself and share things. This has been so fun. I'm so happy we got to do this, and it's so cool how we're all in different places in the world, but we get to connect on Zoom, and it has been such a privilege.
So I want to thank Lauren for being here and for sharing her thoughts on vulnerability and connecting with others. And I think the topic itself brought out a lot of our experiences, and we actually, I think, ended up creating almost like an experiment of like how vulnerability can create connection and strangers. In this case, you just met Lauren an hour and a half ago, and like I feel like we've been through so much in the last hour and a half. The whole conversation allowed us to reflect on vulnerability, not just as a feeling, but the purpose that it serves. Thank you so much to Lauren.
Thank you so much to all of you for having me. It has been, I've been looking forward to this all week. Like every day I'm like, 3 days till Village Kids, 2 days till Village Kids. Apparently don't have much else going on, but I have so looked forward to, and it has surpassed all of my expectations. Like this has been just so fun. I'm so happy that we got to do this, and I'm so grateful that you even thought of me to be a guest on this show. That is, I can't wait to see like blow up. Thank you to all of you.
Bye.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for
Bye,
listening.
everyone.